Having turned Dominic Toretto against his once invincible team, a high-tech terrorist seizes control of a nuclear arsenal and threatens the safety of the entire world. Faced with a new menace unlike any they've ever encountered before, our heroes must prepare for an entirely new mission by developing a new set of skills to... No, actually, they do not. They just still drive cars. They drive cars very, very fast in places where cars are not necessarily expected to be driven that fast, or at all. That is still pretty much the franchise. At this point, the Fast and Furious franchise represents something like the longest ironic joke ever told to global movie audiences. At some point in the white noise between the sequels, a series initially dedicated to showing off expensively outfitted cars, an almost determinedly anti-charismatic lead actor who we at one point thought was going to be a much bigger star, granted, and pretty much nothing else, metamorphosed into an over-the-top parody of itself that endures by impressively resisting all opportunities to actually acknowledge that it is a parody, and is now also increasingly centered on a super charismatic actor who's turning out to be a much bigger star than anyone could have anticipated. And yet the franchise continues apace, powered by an innate sense of audience connectivity that understands better than any modern action film, outside of maybe the first Avengers movie, that audiences will forgive almost any naps in narrative logic so long as the leap of faith lands somewhere entertaining. When exactly did a crew of street racing reprobates and literal highway robbers transform fully into a team of justice-seeking mercenaries for hire? What year does the third movie actually take place in again? Why does Hobbs continue to use Toretto's team even for missions that do not explicitly relate to car driving until they show up? Does anyone remember that the first movie just wasn't even very good to begin with? Don't ask those questions, you're spoiling everyone's good time. And it is still a good time, just maybe not as great of a time this time. Don't get me wrong, the car stunts and the action beats are as good as they've ever been, new director F. Gary Gray being an old pro at this sort of thing, and the by now returning cast have all settled nicely into what passes for characterization in this series for their individual roles, i.e. keep a straight face, work your specific routine, occasionally wink to the audience to indicate that you also have no idea what purpose Tyrese's character actually serves. But the letdown is, well, for the first time in a while, the sense of the franchise going above and beyond expectations just isn't quite there. It's still getting bigger and more absurd, but almost mechanically so. The cool new gag of the team fighting against a whole city's worth of remote-controlled zombie cars is awesome, but it only really gets busted out for one scene. The implications of Charlize Theron's new villainous Cypher having some kind of deep lore connection to the series turns out to just be a standard retcon, making her the vague mastermind behind the last two movies worth of bad guys, and Toretto's much-hyped bad guy turn lacks a lot of intrigue. It's made explicit from the start that he's being manipulated against his will, and his own scheme for turning the tables is teed up for the audience way too early. And not to tell tales out of school, but it ends up feeling increasingly like what it seems to have been, a way to keep Vin Diesel at the nominal forefront of the storyline without having to have him spend as much time working with the rest of the ensemble, or maybe just not with The Rock. And that's probably the most unfortunate aspect keeping Fate of the Furious from rising to the occasion. You can really feel the absence of the late Paul Walker in the group dynamic, and it doesn't feel like the franchise has worked out a new person to be the glue to hold all the other personalities together as a unit. And that's something that really matters when you've got to sell increasingly absurd status quo evolutions like Jason Statham's credulity-straining elevation to the good guy side, a face turn that makes so little sense and feels so forced, I assume he'll be married to Bulma by the time the next movie starts up. Although Statham does feature in the film's best action sequence by far, which oddly is one that has absolutely nothing to do with cars. Look, The Fate of the Furious is not a bad movie by any stretch of the imagination, but the whole hook of this franchise for a long time now has been that these things turn out so much better than you'd imagine a bunch of pyrotechnic bullshit about B-list actors fighting terrorism with race cars would be, and this one is, well, it's only about as good as you'd reasonably expect. It's fine, but it doesn't reach that signature Fast and Furious transcendence, even as it ramps up the ridiculous stunts, admirably diverse camaraderie, and Vin Diesel's increasingly extraterrestrial pronunciation of the word family. And it signals a worrying sense that the series may have peaked with 2 installments left to go. For now, 2.5 stars, it's a good time, but we had every reason to expect more.